Thanks for tuning in to the Pride, Prejudice, and Popcorn podcast, a companion to our book and film club by the same name that will be going on for the entire year of 2025 as we celebrate Jane Austen's 250th birthday during our year with Jane Austen. On this podcast, we'll be having some fun doing a broad overview of Jane Austen's work, but if you are interested in more, including our in-person book and film club, in-depth discussions and lectures, and family-friendly activities, please check out our website and calendar for those, as well as other great events and our library podcast, Books and Beyond. All this and more can be found at winterparklibrary.org. Hello, and welcome to the Pride, Prejudice, and Popcorn podcast. My name is Emerald. I'm one of the librarians here at Winter Park Library. Today we're going to be talking about Jane Austen's third published book, Mansfield Park. A heads up for anyone listening, there will be spoilers of the books and the adaptations. Joining me today is Samantha, our community engagement assistant, and we are also again joined by Delicia, a member of our youth team, as well as blog coordinator for the Jane Austen Summer Program and administrator for the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. To get started, let's go around. Tell us your familiarity level with Jane Austen. Delicia, I know you answered this when you were on for Sense and Sensibility. Samantha, what is your familiarity with Jane Austen, with this book, or just with the Regency Era themed literature in general?
Yeah, so I have zero experience at all. Never read Jane Austen, watched one episode of Bridgerton. I don't know anything. So I was coming in very blind, just knowing that this was a romance.
Was this your first Jane Austen book?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It was not what I was expecting.
Before we get into the overview, I do have a quick challenge. Give me your best one-sentence summary of the book.
Well, I would say, everybody hates Fanny, but, to the everybody hates Chris jingle.
That's funny. I say everyone's in love with the wrong person, in my opinion.
Very complicated romance.
Very complicated. Fanny Price is removed from her impoverished home to be raised with her wealthy cousins at Mansfield Park, headed by Sir Thomas. While being brought up, Fanny is constantly reminded of her lower rank, and her only friend is found in her cousin Edmund, whom she comes to love. When Sir Thomas is called away to Antigua and the Crawfords, a young and lively brother and sister, move in nearby, Mansfield Park is overrun by frivolity and flirtation. Our main characters are Fanny Price, Edmund Bertram, Mary and Henry Crawford, but we also have Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram, Mrs. Norris, and Maria and Julia Bertram. What were some of your impressions as you worked through this book?
Well, as someone who really was expecting this to be a romance, I was like, where's the romance? What's happening? Because I was thinking, okay, we have our cousin, and we have this Henry guy who seems kind of terrible. So what are we doing here?
Surprise! That is the romance.
Wait a minute.
So right off the bat, we have cousins ultimately marrying cousins.
First cousins.
First cousins, exactly. Delicia, can you kind of shine any sort of historical context on this practice?
Yes. So it wasn't
a little
actually
awkward.
yes, very awkward. It wasn't uncommon for cousins to marry. So it's just a little unsettling, of course, for modern readers. So interestingly enough, this comes up in Jane Austen's novels. Not to give any spoilers, but Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins does try to marry one of the Bennet daughters, and those are his cousins. And then we have in Persuasion Mr. Elliot and Anne Elliot, so they were also cousins. And Jane Austen's brother, Henry, so another Henry, not Henry Crawford, but he actually married their first cousin, Eliza, in 1797. And one thing with the cousins together is just like in Mansfield Park, where Edmund and Fanny kind of grow up together as siblings. It was the same for Henry and Eliza, where they spent most of their childhood together. And Jane Austen, she actually, their flirtatious behavior towards each other made it into her juvenilia works. It was a story, Henry and Eliza.
Oh, boy.
And yes, but they were happily married until Eliza died in 1813. And Jane loved Eliza as both a cousin and a sister-in-law. Must have been awkward.
So you do have to kind of go into these with, like, it's odd to us as modern readers, but it was a more common practice at the time.
Yes, and Henry actually loved Mansfield Park. He's probably one of the few people who loved Mansfield Park.
Had a strong feeling.
Well, and it's interesting because the conversation that happens right at the beginning of the book, there's even that voicing a concern that, oh no, I don't want my sons to fall in love with this girl. Like, we have to raise her knowing that she is beneath all of us. And they're like, oh, it's going to seem like you're raising her sister. There's no worry for this to happen.
Yeah, I should have thought of it as foreshadowing, but I was like, yeah, of course. Yeah, brother and sister.
It kind of comes up through the novel where Edmund does look at her as a sister.
Yes. Even though Fanny is not looking at him as a brother.
Yeah, he does that like almost till the last moment.
Well, that
too.
was similar in Sense and Sensibility as well. So those are two comparisons where both of them, there was a romantic relationship that really is not revealed fully until the very end of the book. And then also at the beginning, that first chapter has such an insufferable conversation. In Sense and Sensibility, it was I'm blanking on their names right now. Eleanor and Marianne's older brother.
Oh,
That guy.
Eleanor and Marianne's older brother is talking to his wife, and she is convincing him not to give them any sort of financial assistance. And that conversation drove me up the wall. And then in this one, we have Mrs. Norris and Lady Bertram and Sir Thomas all talking about, like, wouldn't it be so wonderful of us to raise Fanny Price? But, like, let's make sure she knows her place and make sure she knows how grateful she should be. But, like, also, aren't we so kind? And it was another conversation that just made me crazy and immediately set the tone for how I felt about them, especially Mrs. Norris.
Yeah.
She drove me nuts.
yeah, horrible woman.
So for me, Mrs. Norris was the least likable person in this book. But Fanny and Edmund both kind of have this legacy of being Jane Austen's most least likable main characters.
I think it's because they're such Puritans. They're like, no fun. No, everyone must be very polite. Everyone has to keep their emotions down low. Don't be loud. I think it's just because they feel so prudish, and like they're both like with one mind. Since Edmund really shaped Fanny and how she sees the world and her opinions. They're both like, yes, we all agree that we should all just be praying all the time.
There is, since you brought that up, there is something kind of uncomfy about how Edmund has poured so much of himself into Franny so that her thoughts would always reflect his, and then for them to end up together.
Yes, it was very much raising your bride.
Yeah. Who is also your cousin.
Who's also your first
But
cousin.
who was meant to be raised for you to think of as a sister. There is something uncomfortable
And
in that thought.
Fanny thinks about it all the time throughout the book that, like, I think this way because Edmund taught me this way.
Yes. And even Edmund sometimes is talking to her and he's like, but we could never disagree on a subject. Your thoughts are so much like mine. When would we ever think differently on a topic? Delicia, what do you think is behind Fanny and Edmund being disliked? Because I'll be honest, I liked Fanny. I felt bad for her for the most part.
Yeah, personally, I like Fanny. I think people don't always take into consideration her background compared to the other Austen main characters, the leading ladies. she is the only one to come from poverty, versus the other characters where they are either very well off, like Emma Woodhouse, and then you have ones who are part of the so-called pseudo-gentry. She is the only one to actually come from poverty, and I feel that would have an impact on her character, and then especially how she is treated in the household. She's not treated as an equal. And even with Mrs. Norris, I don't want to use any modern terms, but it is pretty abusive, the emotional abuse that she suffers as well. So
It's relentless.
Yes, it is. And I think it's unfair to compare her to like Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse. They have a different background from her. But she is seen as, and I'm just based on over the years what I've heard people say about her, as a prude, judgmental, holier than thou, and Edmund gets the same characterization from people. In fact, when she was writing Mansfield Park, her mother referred to Fanny as insipid. And yes, poor Fanny. She wasn't liked by Jane Austen's mother,
Poor
Mrs.
Fanny.
Austen. Yes.
Catch a break.
Poor Fanny can't find approval from any mother.
And her brother Edward actually did like Fanny. I don't know what Henry's opinion of Fanny was. He did love Mansfield Park, but I couldn't find anything about Henry's opinion of Fanny specifically. And one of Jane Austen's nieces, Anna, could not bear her. That was what she explicitly said.
I truly don't understand. I liked Fanny. I felt for her. There was only a couple points where I was like, come on, Fanny, be a girl's girl. Like when Mary Crawford was showing kindness to her and being friends with her, and Fanny was just like, oh, I kind of wish I could love her. I acted like I loved her, but I really didn't. And it felt to me like a little shallow and a little judgmental. But then ultimately, Fanny is correct in her judgment of Mary.
Yeah.
So, yeah, for her judgment, Fanny is pretty much always right.
Yeah, and I understood that, like the disdain for the Crawfords, and like even when they were acting nice, being like, I've seen how you've acted before. I see how you change your ways, and you guys are little actors. So it was hard to take it as genuine, even though like at points I'm like almost won over.
Same.
And I'm like,
Almost.
you have to stay strong, because I'm like, no, I've seen how you were like little chameleons and just like trying to shape yourself to the person you're like focusing on. But when her cousins were there, they didn't care about her at all. So
No.
I felt like, Fanny, you're right. You need to stay strong in your heart.
Henry almost got me. I'm not going to lie. He did almost convince me. And I was even telling myself, like, of course he wasn't paying attention to her before. Everyone in this household is, Fanny is beneath us, Fanny is lower, and Fanny herself puts herself in the back of the room, in the back of the crowd. It could only be natural that maybe people don't really see her until some of the distractions, i.e. the sisters, are out of the house. So he almost got me. He almost had me sympathizing for him. But Fanny had it right from the beginning.
Yeah, you really had to remind yourself, like, Henry, his, like, hobby is, like, getting girls to fall in love with him.
Yes.
That's, like, his job to him. So he's good at it.
And so on that note, when reading this and Henry is coming across, and he at first is honest, he's like, I'm planning on making Fanny fall in love with me just because I'm bored and I need something to do. But then he presents this idea that his opinions have changed and he really means it and he's really selling it. Like, I'm going to marry her. He gets her brother promoted. He does so much. And I just said that I did. Did you guys also believe that he was genuine or that he could be genuine?
I did and I didn't. I feel like with Henry Crawford, there's a lot of potential there, but he just wasn't willing to give up his vices and work on himself was the problem.
He was so likable and so talented and had, I think even Fanny points this out, that he has like such capacity of being good and then just isn't.
Yeah, I truly believe that he believed in his feelings, that he believed, like, I'm in love, and maybe he was, but I felt like he was too changeable, and he didn't have that conviction or steadiness.
Him and his sister both kind of had that tendency.
Yeah.
Where when they're in Mansfield Park or in that area and they're in the country and there's nothing going on, they're so bored. But then when they leave for the country, oh, how I miss you so much. Like, they very much change depending on the circumstances and the people that they're around.
Yeah, they're really interesting because at some points it feels like they're like innocent and they don't mean to be mean or they don't mean to be so manipulative. And then other times they have like these moments where they're discussing things with each other where they're like, yeah, I'm just doing things to like amuse myself. I don't care. So it's like, what's true? I'm like, is this the writing that's weird, that it's showing them genuine and also not genuine, or it's just, are they having memory blanks?
She plays with dialogue. She, meaning Jane Austen, plays with dialogue a lot in this book. And at first it was kind of hard for me to like struggle through because there would be just full pages of just one person speaking for such a long time. But as you read on and you kind of get the gist of what's going on, you realize that she's really playing with the way that all the characters talk and shows how, Mrs. Norris changes her tune when she's corrected by either Edmund or Sir Thomas, or how Mary Crawford says one thing with one person and then turns around and says something else with someone else. So I think that was really well done, if it was just a little difficult to get through. So overall, what are your impressions of Mary and Henry Crawford?
I never really warmed up to Mary Crawford. I know she's just very complicated. I think Henry is a little bit easier for me. I think with Henry, there's these really like beautiful paragraphs, like you're reading about kind of his inner thoughts. There was the one in particular where I think Fanny's brother made a comment about her hairstyle, and then it made her blush, and then Henry Crawford saw it, like her blush, and like how she can feel things. And it was this very lovely paragraph. I don't get that from Mary Crawford. I don't get the like lovely paragraphs like that. That's like really nice to read. So maybe I'm a little biased towards Mary Crawford for that reason. But there was also the scene where Mrs. Norris, when everyone's trying to convince Fanny to be in the play, and Mrs. Norris makes that really horrible comment to her, and how even Mary is a little taken aback, and I think that was like really genuine when she goes over and comforts Fanny.
I did love that moment.
Yes. I think really maybe the issue with Mary was that she really wasn't right for Edmund. I don't think they were compatible. So maybe it's also, as a reader, that kind of could be a little bit of a bias, like against her because of that.
She really came out the gate swinging with being so disappointed that Edmund wanted to be a clergyman. The conversation that happens when they're touring the Rushworth's house, Southerton, I think it's called, when they go through the chapel, and she goes off about how boring sitting in church and listening to sermons is, and how nobody is listening, and all of it is just a farce and a waste of time, not knowing that Edmund is waiting to be ordained. That was such a painfully awkward interaction. She really put her foot in her mouth, but then she just sort of digs her heels in about it. So I think for me, that was the moment that I was really put off by her, and that she would even go as far as to try to undermine him and try to convince him not to move forward with this chosen profession. I did not care for that. So like you, I was more turned off by Mary Crawford, and Henry, it was easier for me to kind of warm up to him a bit and make it more believable that maybe he could be genuine in his feelings.
Yeah, I had like the same moments, and that whole time they were at that location, I was shocked by that she was so comfortable saying these things to these people she really just met. And even besides that, like the length of the path, I was like, why is she arguing so hard that it's a mile or it's not? Why is she just like likes to argue, and she doesn't take other people's opinions. Like she makes like, this is what she thinks is right, and everything everyone else says is just something she needs to argue about. And it seems like she saw it as flirting, but it seemed upsetting. It was upsetting to read it.
Yeah, that sort of challenging people to a back and forth, she thought was maybe a little more attractive than it was. I mean, it clearly worked on Edmund.
Somehow.
And
where, like, I think with Henry, once he was like, I'm infatuated with Fanny, he had like a lot of cute and genuine moments, like him reading Shakespeare and like looking at her like, oh, are you impressed by my Shakespeare? And then him being like, there won't be any theater at my house because, Fanny doesn't like that. And I thought it was just nice.
At the end of the day, I think that Fanny required too much from him. Or required him to... She didn't require too much for him. She required him to be more than just this frivolous, out for a fun time person. She required him to like reach his potential, and he was not going to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but the whole thing with Henry and Fanny reminded me of one of those like really bad 90s like teen rom-coms where the guy is like a challenge to like get this girl who is really too good for him, and she ignores him, and he's like, no, I'm
10 Things I Hate About You, starring Julia Stiles and Heath Ledger.
That's what I was thinking of.
Based off of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Glad we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I definitely had that. Like, it feels like he's very carefully choosing things. How I thought about it was, this might not be relatable at all, but like in dating sims, you're like trying to go for a specific romanceable character, and he's chosen Fanny. So he has like 3 dialogue options, and he's like, which one will she like the best? And that's how he's like operating. Like, not like she's like a real person, but he's like checking off boxes. Like, I know she likes this.
And what's crazy is the moments when he gets closest to actually eliciting feelings of affection from her are when he's being genuine and maybe a little off guard or showing like vulnerability. That's when he gets closest to actually maybe making a dent.
Yeah.
But he just is so aggressive in his pursuit of her that she's immediately put off.
Yeah, I put like in my notes like, get off her. Leave her alone.
Truly, I think in my notes, when he announces to Mary that he's going to pursue Fanny, I think in my notes I put, who do you think you are?
Right.
Who is this man? So marriage is also coming up a lot in this book. Who is going to marry who? We have Maria Bertram, the oldest sister, who is engaged to a Mr. Rushworth specifically for his money, not because of love. And she has a flirtation with Henry, which it's observing that puts Fanny off. And then we find out later that there's also an affair between the two of them while he was supposedly wooing Fanny. So he does ultimately end up being a villain. So there's a lot of conversations that happen revolving marriage and the relationships and class dynamics, but there's some other things going on as well that could possibly be being commented on. And Delicia, I know that this is something that you wanted to bring up and that we do have to address. Sir Thomas Bertram, sorry, where he is getting his wealth from is he has a plantation in Antigua. And the kind of inciting incident for everything in this book is he leaves and there is no more order at Mansfield. Everything is kind of chaotic. And then he comes back and everything sort of snaps back into, law and order. Can we talk about Sir Thomas? Can we talk about the slave trade and how Jane Austen is possibly relating that to the marriage market?
So
I know that this is a tough
yes.
topic, but it does come up, and Fanny flat out asks Sir Thomas about it.
Yes. You can't discuss Mansfield Park, unfortunately, without bringing up the slave trade. I'm not going to give an entire lecture on it, but just to give everyone who's listening a background. So, as Emerald, you said, Sir Thomas Bertram owns a sugar plantation in Antigua. People reading Mansfield Park when it was first published would understand completely what that entailed. Country estates, many of them, if not all of them, were bought, built, and renovated with money from the transatlantic economy. What do we mean by the transatlantic economy in 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries? So you have this network of trade between Europe and Africa, the Americas. A large part of that economy is the selling of human bodies, selling and purchasing of human bodies. Many country house owners, so like Sir Thomas Bertram, they would sometimes invest in the slave trade. Others may have owned slave ships, and then others would have plantations in the West Indies. Britain was one of the most prolific slave trading powers in Europe between 1640 and 1807. The British involvement in the slave trade ended in 1807, had the Slave Trade Abolition Act. However, slavery would continue in the British Caribbean until 1833. So, many people opposed the abolition of slavery, of course, and it wasn't always from a standpoint of, and I'm being very sensitive when talking about this, of course, it wasn't always about Africans being inferior to whites, but many people had financial stakes in the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about large amounts of money. So, of course, the people who owned the plantations, did not want to give up their property because that was money. But you also have industries that's involved in the slave trade. So you have like the insurance industry, because enslaved people were things. These were commodities. So you have insurance. Same thing with the ships. And chain makers in Birmingham.
Wow.
You had the cotton industry in northern England. So they relied on the cotton produced by enslaved people. And the military. And Fanny's brother is actually in the military, but the military, of course, benefited from the slave trade as well. And there was also just many powerful allies with trying to keep slavery legal. You had military officials, you had government officials, and you also have these country house owners who have a lot of say-so in government. And of course, we know eventually the slave trade is abolished. So why am I giving everyone this background? Is not only is Sir Thomas Bertram owns a sugar plantation, but there, as Emerald mentioned, there's the scene where Sir Thomas returns from Antigua and Fanny asks him about the slave trade. And she is met with a dead silence. by her cousins, and she stops. Why is that in the novel? And we don't know exactly what Fanny asked. You kind of assume she didn't ask anything that was extremely offensive. We know she has to walk on eggshells with this family. Was it just her mentioning the slave trade? Maybe there was something going on in court proceedings that she was privy to. It's because there's a lot in the court system as to trying to either keep slavery, abolish slavery. So there may have been something that she heard or read. We don't know. But we do know she dropped the subject.
Even the fact that in that scene it was met with such silence when most of the people in this novel cannot keep their mouths shut. The fact that she asks this question about Sir Thomas's business and it's just met with such an abrupt silence that she drops the topic is an observation on something, that this is a topic that we're not going to talk about in this house and that you shouldn't be asking about. So that in itself is almost an acknowledgement that there's something that we don't want to touch here. And for Jane Austen to include that, you would observe that it was intentional.
Most likely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to also think about it from the viewpoint of the Bertrams. Everything they have comes from the slave trade.
Right.
And that's all that the slave trade entails. The physical and psychological violence of it. That they get to live in luxury because of that. So it's probably extremely uncomfortable for them to acknowledge that as well. You can imagine really in our day where if you have a product that comes from a certain country that relies on child labor, the company uses child labor to make it, how if you're at a table and someone brings that up, how uncomfortable it would be. So kind of looking at it that way. And then you also wonder if that is a criticism of the family and that they can so easily just be silent and perhaps change the subject, or they obviously make Fanny uncomfortable enough to drop the conversation, as you said. There's also another element to that, because going back to the slave trade and the abolition movement, women were actually a huge part of that, but they were oftentimes kind of written out of the history of that, behind that movement. And even some of the campaigners like William Wilberforce did not want women involved in the campaign. So it's also interesting that there is a female character bringing up, about the slave trade in a novel.
Again, using dialogue to really kind of pack a punch, basically.
Yes.
And it's interesting that Fanny is constantly told how grateful she should be to be there and how much she has been provided for and how lucky she is to be growing up in this wealthy house and living in this luxury coming from her background. And so for it to be Fanny to bring up where that luxury and where that wealth and where all of that comes from that she is supposed to be so grateful for, it's almost like making them uncomfortable twofold, basically.
Yes. And besides that scene, there's other references as well. Of course, the novel is named Mansfield Park. So Mansfield, where does that name come up? So some people think it references Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice of England. He was the Chief Justice from 1756 to 1788. And he played a key role in ending slavery. he wasn't responsible for it being abolished, but he had two cases that set the legal precedence for ending slavery. I'm not going to go into the legal mojo
Right.
on the podcast, but some listeners may think that name I just said, Lord Mansfield, is a bit familiar, especially if you're a period drama fan. So Lord Mansfield, one of his nephews, brought his illegitimate daughter to England to live with Lord Mansfield and his wife. Her name was Dido Bell. If anyone has seen the film Belle, that is loosely based on Dido Bell's story. So Lord Mansfield himself had an illegitimate great niece whose mother was a enslaved woman.
Wow.
Some people think that may have had an impact on his legal rulings. We don't know for sure. But it's interesting that for the title, that's the name that Jane Austen chooses, is Mansfield.
So we can't know for sure, obviously. She's not here for us to ask, but it does seem that there are too many references and too many intentional points for it to feel like she didn't include all this on purpose. So it's important that we bring it up and talk about it because those scenes are in there for a reason. Moving on from that to the marriage market.
So this is where the discussion of Mansfield Park could get a little complicated.
Right.
And Mansfield Park is probably Austen's most complex novel. What exactly is she saying? And I probably should also mention that it is generally agreed that Jane Austen was against slavery. There was a anti-abolitionist that she very much respected. I think she, in a letter to Cassandra, she said that she's in love with him. I think his name is Thomas Clarkson. And so some people read Mansfield Park, though, very differently. So when it comes down to some of the post-colonial theory that comes in, some of the feminist theory, it can get a little complicated. I'm going to try to keep it very simple for the point of the podcast. But some people, some readers and some scholars have seen a connection between the marriage market in Mansfield Park and also the slave trade. And this is not at all to compare women marrying to people being enslaved at all, but just some of those parallels where women have to be kind of, they're like commodities and they have to be marketable in a sense, and kind of relate that as respectfully as possible to the slave trade, where bodies are being sold. In a sense, in a marriage market, women are being also purchased. What is the last name of our leading lady? Price. So there is these ideas of, in the novel also, with the women, and how they're trying to navigate the marriage market. And Jane Austen is always critical of the marriage market, not of marriage per se, but of this kind of society, this microcosm of people having to kind of offer up like their beauty, their submissiveness, being submissive, which is also where slaves had to be submissive. They have to have the strength to benefit, be of a benefit in the slave trade, and women, their only benefit being in marriage. I don't agree with really putting those two things.
They're not comparable.
Yes.
By any means.
But it does come up a bit in the conversations about Mansfield Park.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for shining a historical context on that, because I do think it is important for us to remember that and make notice of those points where she brings it up in the book and not just sort of glaze over it as another cute scene that she wrote in. She puts things in books with intention. So thank you very much. Moving on from that subject, other themes in the book. We've touched on this a little bit, but social class, manners versus morals, the role of women in society. What are some points in the book that you feel like really exemplified these themes, or what are some other themes that you think are present?
I think when Fanny goes back to visit her family, it was an interesting time of class because people were like, oh, you're going to be so grateful again that you get to see your family. And then when she goes there, she feels very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, it's so messy, it's so loud, no one has any manners. And she finds it very distressing to be there.
Very loud.
Yeah, very loud. And so I was sitting there thinking, okay, what does this mean? What is this communicating? Poor people are bad? Surely not. Mm-hmm. So that's one part where it's like, it felt like she was being saved from her family. Like, would she be happy growing up in this situation? But, like, maybe she would be a very different person if she did grow up in that situation.
Well, and Sir Thomas even says that he's hoping that time with her poor family will sort of humble her a little bit into accepting Henry Crawford's proposal, because she'll, see how good she has it, which is a really upsetting way to think of when you're sending your niece to visit her family that she hasn't seen for her whole life almost. And we do know that she loved her family when she was taken. She was 10 years old when she was removed from her family. So it's not like she was a small child with no memory. She was 10 years old. We all remember when we were 10 years old. So, and she's so distressed when she gets to Mansfield Park. She's constantly crying. She's constantly upset. She misses her family. So would she have had those thoughts if she had been allowed to stay with her family?
She talked about how she was almost a mother to her youngest siblings, and now she doesn't even know them when she's visiting them, and she has no authority with them. She has no sway with them because she's a stranger to them too.
And we also see that her mother, while not unkind, is definitely favoring the sons. So at the same time, you also wonder if she had stayed there, would she have also been overlooked there as well? Poor Fanny.
Yeah, she couldn't catch a break anywhere.
Come on, why are people hating on Fanny so much?
And it was interesting because, like, back with her cousins, it's like the cousins are really doted on, like the sisters, where you don't see the same type of favoritism because the sons, like, Tom is always out. He's never there a lot of the times.
Right.
And they have a rapport with each other that feels a bit more equal, even though they have different expectations in life.
Yeah.
It's different the way their parents treat them.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Roses and thorns. So for this segment, we talk about our roses and thorns. Roses being your favorite part of the book, the most rewarding, and thorns being maybe the most challenging, your least favorite, most annoying part of the book. So if you had to decide what would be your rose and what would be your thorn.
I was trying to really think of a rose.
I can tell you. Let me see. Let me go back to my notes. My thorns, the whole theater business, the whole play went on entirely too long. I was exhausted by the end of that, between the entrance of Mr. Yates to the play and everyone arguing about the play and bringing in people to mess up the room and rehearsing it, just, and everyone henpecking Edmund and Fanny to be in it went on so long. I was so relieved when Sir Thomas came back and just ended that entire sequence. It was too much, in my opinion.
Yeah, truly, it was one of those times where you think, man, they really need a hobby or a job or something to do, because they're so desperate for stimulation that they get into these silly situations. And it's like, man, if they just had something they like to do, we wouldn't be in this situation.
It went on so long. And I understand that the play was sort of an avenue for Mariah and Henry to sort of have their flirtation in front of everybody with everyone thinking it's part of the play. But at the same time, it went on so long.
Oh, I could think of a rose. It finally came to me. I do love the relationship between Fanny and William.
Yes.
I think, yeah, that's very, very lovely. I don't know, it's probably not true, but I feel like he was really the only one in the novel that truly cared for her, really.
I think Edmund did really care about her. Whenever somebody in the room is kind of making either a direct or sideways comment against Fanny, Edmund does speak up and say, no, Fanny's wonderful. What are you talking about? And he does advocate for her. Even before, she all of a sudden turns beautiful and everyone wants to pay attention to her now. He's genuinely a friend to her, and he does care about her well-being and her comfort and her happiness. So I did appreciate those moments where Edmund does speak up and say, no, Fanny is great. Stop talking about her like this.
Yeah.
Fanny should get a horse too.
Yeah, I definitely thought of him as like her greatest ally, but he's not the greatest ally in the world. Like, there's no one else better. That's what I was kind of thinking. Like, he often forgets about her and, like, let Fanny use the horse, but then also she doesn't get to use the horse for, like, days.
There are multiple points in the book where Edmund is like, Fanny, I'll be right back. And he walks away and he's just gone.
It's so rude.
He leaves her in the garden. He leaves her waiting for her horse. He leaves her in Portsmouth waiting for a letter from him, and when he finally does write, he's like, no, you don't understand. I couldn't even write you a sentence. It was impossible.
Yeah, was not a fan. But yeah, with William, it was just like he always was loving. I guess a flower for me was finally getting Mrs. Norris to leave. When I found out that she was like banished to the countryside or wherever she went, I was like, hooray.
Could not tolerate her. She was insufferable.
Yeah, actually that relates to My Thorns, where it's like, it felt like the climax happened like in a different world and we were told about it like third hand. Like, we didn't get to like be in it to see everyone like crumble and fall. We didn't get to see really Mrs. Norris like fall and go away somewhere else. We didn't get to see Fanny and Edmund really get together. Instead, it was kind of like a summary.
There's a little bit of that in Sense and Sensibility as well. We don't see the big scene where everything comes out that like Lucy Steele is going to marry the older brother, and I'm forgetting everyone's names from Sense and Sensibility. Edit this out. And Eleanor's love interest, tells everyone that he's in love with Eleanor and he's gonna go marry her. Edward, thank you. We don't see where Edward, declares himself, and all the family drama comes spilling out. We find out about that later, and him and Eleanor getting together happens off screen. We just know that it happens. So I think that Lisa pointed this out in the last episode, that does tend to happen in Jane Austen's novels, where whatever this big climax is, it happens where we don't see it.
Yeah, I was actually surprised because I was looking, I felt like this book lacked interiority. Like, we don't get to see Fanny's deepest thoughts. It's like we're on the surface of her mind, it felt like. And I was like, is that normal? And when I was looking up, things about Jane Austen's writing style, and they were like, oh yeah, she was revolutionary and like showing characters' thoughts and feelings. I was like, oh, I felt very distant reading this book. Like, I felt like I was very conscious I was reading a book, where it didn't feel like I was experiencing things with Fanny. I was just kind of like, Fanny, please tell me more. Like, I can tell that you're feeling more than what you're telling me. And like, you can tell me, I'm the reader.
The most connected I felt was during the whole segment where Henry Crawford is proposing and professing his love and trying to woo her. And she's just, no, 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 no. Not ever. Get away from me. Oh, the scene with her and Sir Thomas where Sir Thomas is just berating her for turning this man down, and she's suffering so much because also the reason that she can't tell him why she's saying no is because she's protecting the integrity of his daughters.
Yeah.
She's not going to rat out Mariah and Julia to him.
Yeah, actually, I thought this, like, you know, when her feelings are bubbling up, I thought the writing style suited Fanny because Fanny is very, like, subdued and is always, like, thinking about how she's being perceived because people are always snapping at her if she shows emotion. So it felt like even the writing style was controlled.
People are always telling Fanny about herself.
Yes.
And she doesn't really ever get a chance to say who she is for herself. So for me, that was like probably the emotional high for the book. Okay. So Mansfield Park was first published in 1814. Here is a brief list of things that were happening at the time. Lord Byron publishes The Corsair, which sells thousands of copies on its publication day. A volcano in the Philippines erupts and kills 1,200 people, and a burst vat at a brewery results in the London beer flood, where more than 300,000 gallons of beer flood a neighborhood and kill 8 people. Those were not very cheerful observations, but there was also a lot going on military-wise. The Napoleonic Wars are still going on, and there's also the War of 1812, which went on until 1815. So Napoleon that year is exiled to the island of Elba after the War of the Sixth Coalition, and the British are also involved in a series of battles along the Atlantic coast of the United States and Canada, including the capture and burning of Washington, D.C., which is the first time since the Revolutionary War that the capital is captured and occupied by a foreign power. And they set fire to so many landmarks, including the White House. And also that is the year that we get the Star-Spangled Banner. So some United States history tied in with British history there for the year that this one is published. As of this year, Mansfield Park has been adapted into a BBC miniseries and 2 movies by the title name. It's also been compared to a 1990s rom-com called Metropolitan. There was also a BBC Radio 4 adaptation with Felicity Jones, Benedict Cumberbatch, and David Tennant that I imagine was probably awesome. Are you familiar with any of these? What are your favorites? What are the worst ones in your opinion?
So I've only seen the 1999, so I don't have anything else to compare it to. It did take a lot of liberties with the novel. It brought a bit more of the slave trade into the film. There's actually a very controversial scene where Fanny is looking at these drawings in Tom's room, and it depicts it's very graphic in depicting how the slaves are being treated.
Wow.
So that's more in the forefront of the film. And yeah, there's some moments I can't say on a podcast that are pretty graphic. So I like the film on its own, but it's not a good adaptation of the novel, although I don't really think it ever can be. I think it's just not only is a very complicated novel, but also with having a character who's very, I think, where the kind of she's not really in the action, if that makes sense. She's kind of just always seems to be like a bystander. I think it's really hard to adapt for film.
And also how to make the most unlikable heroine likable for film.
Yeah, that's why she's usually like portrayed as an extrovert in the films. I've heard that from. Yeah, there's a version I can't remember, but it's with Billie Piper.
Yes.
And I've heard the saying that the character's like extroverted in that one.
Try to make her a little feistier.
Yes, which doesn't work with the novel and everything that happens.
I cannot even imagine her being portrayed as an extrovert. That's so far from
that's a different person.
Like the entire plot of the story is Fanny knows about all these people because she's been the quiet observer for like the first 60% of the book. So if this book was being adapted or written today, what are some things that you'd like to see? Alternate endings? What do you think they'd be dealing with, and what still holds up?
This is hard.
Yes.
I saw, like, in our book recommendations on the Year of Jane Austen's website that there's some modern retellings, like some novels. And it's interesting just reading the synopsis, like, okay, they've changed Edmund from her cousin to, like, a neighbor to make it less weird that they get together, or they change it so that her and Edmund don't have a romance. Instead, they're just, like, best friends. And so I think that's an interesting way to go about it. I was like, is there fan fiction about Mansfield Park? And I did look it up. And one of the top, like, rated ones was one where Henry doesn't do all that messed up stuff. And he said he comes back to Fanny. And it's like, what would happen? And that's quite a long fan fiction too. I didn't read it, but I just thought it was interesting. That's what people want to see. Like, if only Henry could be better.
Well, because I think that there's something to be said for this trope of, one character who's very showy and very confident and very sure of himself coming up against a love interest who sees right through them and calls on them to be genuine and to be vulnerable. I think there's something to that is part of the reason why we were all kind of maybe hoping that Henry wasn't a rake, but he was. I have possibly a hot take. I don't know if anyone would agree with me on this front of who I was picturing Henry Crawford as. Jack Black.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm thinking. Just
very, like, at first you're like, I don't know about, because they keep saying how at first they meet him and they're like, he's fine, I guess, but, like, he just has this, like, winning personality. I'm thinking specifically Jack Black in The Holiday or in King Kong.
So when you said that, then that's where my mind did.
School of Rock.
Okay, because I was like, I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask, oh, is she talking about School of Rock Jack Black or The Holiday Jack Black?
The Holiday Jack Black, specifically.
Because I'm thinking Kung Fu Panda.
No.
But, I think it
guys have me, like, really exposing myself on this thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me that Fanny was like, that guy is not handsome. She thought that, like, multiple times. He's just very charismatic.
He's very charismatic.
And I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah.
And if you've seen him in The Holiday or in King Kong, like, he plays that sort of character, specifically King Kong, because his character in that is, like, almost sort of villainous in his ability to get people to carry out his wishes. So pop culture. At first, I was not able to find a media reference to this book at all. But then, thankfully, one of our other librarians pointed out the movie The Jane Austen Book Club, and I guess there is a brief scene where they are talking about Mansfield Park. So I will go ahead and play that clip for you guys.
So what happens?
Well, they decide to put on a play in the house, and rehearsing it sort of unleashes them. Two of them actually fall in love, and one of them, Maria Bertram, is set to marry someone else.
Or maybe not.
Well, I think what Austen is trying to say is that play acting is dangerous. All of that intimacy backstage, the waiting and the whispering, and on stage you're gazing at each other and I love you. I mean, well, you can see how it happens.
Yeah, I can see it happening. Just not with Karen Pave.
I was like, ew.
Yeah, didn't love that. Didn't love that at all.
Yeah,
And I've never very off-putting, and I've never seen that movie, but apparently that is also, like, an inappropriate relationship happening in that movie. So
he could play Henry. Then we can, like, really not like him.
Yes, very, very off-putting. That is the only clip that I had. Okay, so closing thoughts and ratings. Year of Jane Austen, Regency, we love to think of tea parties. So we're going to rate this book in how many teacups. So give your closing thoughts on the book and how many teacups you would rate Mansfield Park.
I would give it 3 teacups because while I didn't find it very exciting, I also didn't dislike it. I was never particularly bored. It was kind of weird. It was like a lukewarm, maybe it's lukewarm tea, room temperature tea, where I was like, this is interesting. I think it comes back to the fact that I didn't feel like I was part of the story with Fanny. That it was like something kind of interesting that happened a long time ago that someone else is telling you about, and you're like kind of listening. That's my thoughts.
Lukewarm tea. I'm also going to give it probably 3 teacups.
What's the highest again?
5.
5. Okay. Oh, I have such a complicated relationship with Mansfield Park because it's not like an entertaining read compared to her other novels, but it's so interesting to think about and to talk about. So I'll give it. It's a 3.5. A half a teacup. Does that make sense?
I would
Yeah.
get you.
It's half full.
We can do half cups.
I was thinking about like a cup that was like
Cut
kind
in
of
half?
broken.
Like a Mad Hatter teacup.
Yes, one of those.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Mansfield Park. Our next book in our year with Jane Austen will be Persuasion, and we have other exciting events coming up, so please make sure to check the calendar, and thank you so much for listening.